Welcome back to the Spector Creative channel. I'm your host, Scott Toy Guru Neitlich, a collector and a toy professional for 25 years. And with that combined experience, I like to make videos with some insights about the industry as a collector myself. And I am a collector of DC action figures, and I've gotten to work on DC action figures. So let's talk a little bit about the history of them and how certain companies interact. So DC action figures have had absolute peaks. As an example, in '85 with the Superpowers line, DC toys were so popular that toy companies didn't think that licensing other comic book action figure lines was feasible. In fact, Mattel took a big risk doing the Secret Wars line because with the Superman movie and the 1966 Batman show, everybody knew Batman and Superman. But back then, outside of comic book fans, very few people knew who Captain America was, or at least followed him the way they do today. After that, between Kenner and Hasbro, the DC line kind of flip-flopped back and forth. Kenner would make figures, Hasbro would make figures, a new movie would come out, a new animated series would come out, and this basically went back and forth for several years, and we got some really great quality DC figures throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s, until eventually Hasbro just bought Kenner. Well, they bought Tonka, which owned Kenner, and that meant that there was no longer going to be a flip-flop. But then the license moved over to Mattel, away from Hasbro and or Kenner. And Mattel had the license for a good decade and plus, and made some great DC toys too. And this is the time period when I worked at Mattel and had the absolute honor and privilege of working on DC action figure toys, which was a huge thrill, getting to work on toys aimed at both kids and collectors. And as with most things, when you're talking about the adult collector, we fear change. And all this flip-flopping of the license was, of course, a little crazy, and it was always nice when it landed someplace. Well, nowadays, the DC license is different than it's ever been because it's been split up for the first time, and no longer is a master license given, but it's now between companies like Spin Master and McFarlane, who have different aspects, different scales, different price points, different audiences for the DC license. All right, so with all of this happening at mass retail, what about DC Direct? That other company, elephant in the room, if you will, that's producing DC action figures. How do they fit into this otherwise convoluted swapping of mass retail licenses? Well, DC Direct has a very interesting history. And they started in 1998 producing busts and statues and eventually merged into doing action figures as well in both styles of specific artists and more obscure characters. So while their secret origin isn't that secret, a lot of their reason for being and their justification at the market is a little different from what a lot of fans know. So let's go back and look at some of their stuff and how it evolved. How they went from statues and busts to action figures of obscure characters, and what made the company different from other toy companies producing product at mass retail. And really, the first thing is the fact that these figures not only were more obscure characters, but their distribution was different. DC Direct only shipped product to comic book stores, or what is called in the industry the alternative market. Or AR for short. And this included comic book stores, but it also included other types of retailers and was sort of a large net that anything that wasn't large, big box stores fell into. So it would include things like mom and pop stores where they only had one location, it would include comic book stores, and it would also include odd things like gas stations. Now, contracts for retail lines are pretty clear, but they also give a big loophole for distribution outside of big box retail. And so DC Direct was aimed at those true fans, the fans that were hanging out at comic book stores, the ones that wanted the really obscure characters, knowing they might not sell as well at retail. And unlike the mass retail lines like DC Universe Classics, which I worked on at Mattel, there wasn't as much continuity and scale with DC Direct toys. Sometimes they'd be a little shorter, sometimes a little bigger. They were usually about 7 inches. So why all this discrepancy and why all of this alternative distribution? What made DC Direct different? Well, The big answer is DC Direct was bait. And yeah, no, I don't mean that they were worms. They were anything but that. Like any large corporation, any creative company wants to bring the best possible talent to their headquarters and to their company. And they'll take a lot of strategies in order to bring top-tier talent to work on their product. So how does DC attract top-tier talent to work on their comics? One of the things they had was DC Direct. This was sort of an arrow in their quiver. No pun intended there, Green Arrow. So offering artists the opportunity to have action figures created in their specific style and based on their artwork became a very attractive carrot to bring over talent. So DC would say, hey, come work for us. In addition to a paycheck, we will also make action figures based on your specific style. And who doesn't want that? I mean, who doesn't want an action figure of their interpretation of, say, Batman as an example? And this did indeed attract a lot of talent to DC that a company like Marvel wasn't able to do. Now, there's always advantages and disadvantages to a strategy like this, and part of it plays into the business tactics and the business scenario of the way DC Direct was set up. One advantage they had was zero royalty. They didn't have to pay a royalty because they owned the characters, they owned the IP. They were their own company, they were part of DC. So they could afford to put more into their product without having to pay a royalty because they owned the IP, they were part of DC. In fact, if they broke even on figures, that was great because DC Direct was looked at more as an advertising venue because the figures were sold in comic book stores, they were curating new customers, new fans, and they were bringing in talent to the company and creating partnerships between top talent and DC. So it wasn't something that had to make a lot of money for the company, it had other benefits and brought other advantages. And speaking of partnerships, I should also talk about how they work with retail toy makers like Mattel, when Mattel was making retail toys. Now, DC Direct was great about sharing their plans long term, and we would usually meet with them once or twice a year, and they would go over what was coming out, ideally so that we could work together to avoid too much overlap where both companies weren't putting out the same figures at the same time. One of the things DC Direct did have, though, was they had a huge amount of access to editorial, because the comic books and editorial was one floor down. So they could go down and just casually talk around the water cooler and find out what was happening in the comic books a lot faster than a retail partner. Not just that, but they got faster approvals of their sculpts because it was all happening in the building. So that's why situations like the Brightest Day or Blackest Night toy line, when it came out, DC Direct was able to get these figures out very quickly because they could go downstairs and see what was happening and say, oh, look at that new art. That looks great. We'll make figures of that. So, for example, as a specific figure, Blue Lantern Flash from Brightest Day or Blackest Night, I get confused when they first showed up. You know, one big blur of DC fun in my mind. Either way, DC Direct got this figure out very quickly on shelf while the comic was still in stores. By the time Mattel got reference for the story and was able to develop the figure, interest in the storyline had totally waned, and this figure wound up becoming kind of a bane to fans who felt that it wasn't important anymore because the storyline was way over by the time we got it to market. So, end of an era did come, and eventually DC Direct was absorbed by Warner Brothers Consumer Products and shut down when Warner Brothers, AT&T, and DC all kind of became a corporate conglomerate. But it was a great time, and those years when DC Direct did pump out figures was absolutely fantastic. They got to a character selection that was undreamed of in any other DC toy line, and they were fantastic partners to work for. I always loved our annual and biannual meetings at their offices, and I have some great friendships I made from working with the folks at DC Direct. And in the end, they got out a hoppy action figure. And isn't that what really matters? I hope you enjoyed this video, and it was a good look at how DC Direct and DC retail toy manufacturers work together for mutual DC fan happiness. Thanks so much for watching. Leave comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.